Shalom. Just set up some things here. Welcome again to the old city of Yerushalayim, to Jerusalem. Here in the old city of Yerushalayim, here in the Shorashim, the biblical shop, for our Jerusalem Insights podcast. This week we're going to focus on the Torah portion of Shlach and how that affects us. Remember, we believe that every Torah portion gives a hint of both the illnesses and the remedies that occur in our own week, in our own life, but also in the life of us as a nation, as a people. So I want to use that to focus on using one of the Torah portions, actually the most, one of the more difficult ones, something that has impacted the Jewish people throughout the generations. In fact, at all human beings, actually, but something that still has an ongoing impact that may have very much to do with the election muddle that we're in. So let's begin. Today is May 31st, the 20th of Sivan. The Torah portion is Torah portion of Shlach, where Moshe sends the 12 spies into the land of Israel, Numbers 13, verse 1 to Numbers 15, 41. So we read in the Torah portion of Shlach the following words. Hashem spoke to Moshe, and he's saying, send out for yourself men who will scout the land of Canaan, which I'm giving to the children of Israel. You shall send one man each for his father's tribes. Each one shall be a chieftain in their midst. Numbers 3, verse 1 to 2. Now, you have to understand, these weren't just leaders. These weren't just individuals that were going to be representatives. These were men of distinction. They were the heads of the tribes of Israel. They were people of a stature, both spiritual, intellectual. Moses chose well to choose, and God chose well to choose who would be the leaders of the tribes. And these are the men he sends out to spy out the land. But then when they return, we read the following. Numbers 13, verse 30 to verse 33. They spread an evil report about the land which they had scouted, telling the children of Israel, the land we passed through to explore is a land that consumes its inhabitants. And all of the people who saw it were men of stature. We saw giants, the sons of Anak, descended from giants. In our eyes, we seemed like grasshoppers, and so we were in their eyes. This failure, called the sin of the spies throughout our generations, was not just another example of fear or disobedience. It reflected a much deeper malaise, a much deeper illness. It was so impactful actually, that the date upon which this happened, it turns out that Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of Av, was a day that would be continual in its calamity, historical calamities that occurred at that day. It was a day of great danger and of great failures. So we have to understand, first of all, what happened to these distinguished men, these men of stature, these representatives of all the tribes? How could they fail so miserably? God promised, God delivered them, and they came back and said, no, we can't do it. We can't. We're going into a land that is filled with danger. What happened to them? So it's important for us to understand that, because we know in our tradition that that sin of the spies, the quality of the sin of the spies, would not rest just in those days, and would not only signify a day of great calamity, but it was a sin that would continue to disturb, interrupt, get in the way of Jewish leadership and Jewish people throughout the generations as they walked through the wilderness of exile and even in the land of Israel. So our sages give two different reasons for their failure. The first one, which is a fascinating one, even though they both stem from the same source, but the first one is, remember who we're talking about. These were 10 spies who were spiritual giants. And they were men who experienced the exodus from Egypt. They experienced the splitting of the Red Sea. They experienced wandering in the desert under God's covering. They experienced the manna coming from the heavens. They experienced the meat coming from the heavens. They felt God's hand protecting them everywhere they went, with a pillar of fire at night and a cloud in the daytime. They lived in the desert, but miraculously drank from a well we call the Well of Miriam. They had food to eat every morning. And you think to them, somebody who's in that incredible spiritual experience where everything comes from God, but it's so clear that everything comes from God, you can almost imagine why they say to themselves, why would we leave this? Yes, it's a desert, but we're under God's protection. Everything we want is being given to us. Why would we want to leave that and enter into land where we would have to physically be involved with bringing heaven back to earth and earth up to heaven? Where here it's so simple. God is in front of us. We see him. We know when we do wrong. We also know when we do right. And God's protective hand is upon us at all time. Why would we want to enter a land where we'd have to engage in warfare? We'd have to engage in tilling the ground. Now we get the manna. As soon as they entered the land of Israel, we read in Joshua, the manna stopped. So that was their first difficulty. But the second one, the more difficult one, the one that's actually affecting our lives every single day. They say to them in their words to the people, in our eyes we seemed like grasshoppers, and so we were in their eyes. Numbers 13:33. That was their weakness. It wasn't physical, it was optical. They faltered in their vision. They had a failure in believing in their own divine destiny. They had a failure in believing in their own power to live up to that destiny. They had a failure in believing that they were worthy or capable of living some higher purpose in this world. And so on the one hand, they wanted to live in the spiritual womb that the desert had become. And on the other hand, they didn't believe they had the wherewithal, the ability. These were people came from slave mentalities. We're not worthy to go into that. We don't have the power to engage in that type of physical and spiritual reunification. We don't know how to do that. Yet both these things, both are born out of that same insecurity. I'm not worthy, I'm not capable, I'd rather be here where I'm under the spiritual protection, or I'd rather be here where I don't need to fight battles. I'm good. And that leads to exile. Exile is not necessarily a description of a place, it's a description of a spiritual sense of being. If you don't realize that, if you think that, hey, I'm okay, I've built synagogues, I've built yeshivot, I've built schools of study, and they suddenly believe, well, you know what, maybe we can sing the song of Zion in a foreign land. Exactly the opposite of what Psalms tell us. And just as difficult, even more difficult, after so many years of oppression and hatred and persecution, and Jews being hated because they were too communist, or being too capitalist, or being too small, or being too many, or being too successful, or being poor, whatever it is, the hatred continues to be there. And anybody that's studied a little bit of psychology knows about the abused child syndrome, about the Stockholm syndrome. When you are the victim of abuse consistently from all around you, you start believing that maybe you're the problem. Maybe if I was less me, maybe if I was more politically correct, maybe if I joined the minions of all those people in the world, that political correctness has become the ultimate biblical truth. And so they discard their own spiritual identity. They discard who they are. They'll do everything to be loved and to join up with those that hate who they were as Jews, in order that maybe they'll forget they were Jews and sort of become part of this milieu that has no distinction, that has no nuance. And as a result, they turn against their own destiny and their own people. And that has been a disaster for us throughout the world, but especially in exile. And yet when you come to Israel, things change. You're in a sense where you sense you wake up purposeful. I've mentioned before, I once was interviewed by some individual whose radio station or radio network really is not pro-Israel, National Public Radio. And he wanted to know, what is it about Israel? Why are they constantly showing high up on the happy quotient? What makes they're living in an area surrounded by enemies, hated by those around them, hated by people who aren't even around them, and yet they're always happy. Or they show up high in their happy quotient. They complain, but deep down they're happy. It's because everybody in this land wakes up with a sense of purpose. Everybody wakes up with a sense of destiny. And when you wake up with a feeling that you know your purpose, even though, by the way, we can argue with each other about what that purpose is, but you have a sense of who you are, you're filled with joy. You're filled with a sense of contentment. You know why you're waking up. And yet, even with that, there's a negative side, as all things. Taken wrong or misunderstood can lead to the wrong things. Even in the land of Israel, that sense, the intoxication of being part of a purposeful destiny, historical path, can lead one to be so filled with oneself that they forget that the destiny is being ordained from someplace much higher. And they get so filled with themselves and who they are and what they're doing and how they can do it. After the miraculous 6-day war, they were so filled with themselves that the Yom Kippur War took them completely by surprise. And in that sense of me, we're suddenly in this disastrous mess, political mess. Disastrous, one-party prime minister hated by so many that it's an unusual bag, a mixed bag of parties that are getting together just because they don't like the prime minister. All their ideologies, all their values they stood for, and all come together, even though their values don't mix at all. They're values that are antagonistic one to the other. And yet that's okay. We need to get rid of this man who thinks he can do all. And we need to show them that we're the ones that can take over. Even though we only have seven members of Knesset, we can be the prime minister. And so they'll do everything, including throw out all of their values and ideology, on the one hand. On the other hand, we have a prime minister who has proven himself to be successful in so many realms, but on the other hand, is so filled with his ability to rule that he will do everything possible, including to people who are closest to him, including people that were his advisors. But if he senses from any of them a threat to his power, he will destroy them, create enemies, and now those same people are now on this other side of a mix of parties that may become the next ruling government. I think it's so filled with contradictions that it may not last very long, but either way, that's what's going on, all because you're caught up with the sense of identity and purpose that Israel does give you. Not the grasshopper ideology, but forgetting that and thinking about me. It's all about me. I become the new giant. And what's interesting is we have the answer to that also in the Torah portion. Last week's Torah portion, we read the Haftarah. And the Haftarah comes from Zechariah 4, verse 1 to 6, and it talks about a vision that he's given to see. And the words are the following. And the angel that spoke with me returned and waked me as a man that is wakened out of his sleep. And he said unto me, what do you see? And he said, I see and behold a menorah all of gold with a bowl upon the top of it, and its 7 lamps thereon. There are 7 pipes, yea, 7 to the lamps, which are on the top thereof, and 2 olive trees by it, upon the right side of the bowl, and the other one on the left side. And I answered and spoke to the angel and spoke to me, saying, what are these? Then the angel spoke to me and answered. He said, you know what they are. And I said, no, I don't. And then he answered, spoke to me, saying, this is the word of Hashem unto Zerubbabel, saying, not by might nor by power, but by my spirit, said Hashem of hosts. The emblem of the state of Israel, not the flag, the emblem of the state of Israel is a menorah. And in that menorah, next to the menorah are 2 olive branches representing the 2 olive trees. That's the symbol. And to many who put that symbol together, it's light and it's the olive trees and peace. And God put that image in their minds. Because behind every prime minister, powerful or weak, arrogant or too humble, there's a reminder right behind him as he sits and speaks to the nation. At the Knesset, where all these people are arguing and fighting, there's an emblem, menorah, and 2 olive branches. That's Hashem's way of reminding every single one of them. If they only look over their shoulder, not by might, nor by power, but by my spirit, said Hashem of hosts. Lo b'chayil, lo b'koach, ki im beruchi amar Hashem tzvaot. When we realize that, when we get that, we're going to find ourselves refinding our destiny, refinding our purpose. And in spite of all the little turns and pitfalls that we're going to experience, including the elections, we're going to find ourselves finding our way back, because God's plan of destiny is going to happen regardless of how we can sometimes mess things up. So stay tuned. We will be in touch again. Thank you for sending us emails to shorashimshop@yahoo.com with all your questions, and hopefully we've been able to give you answers over the email. And if I've forgotten to answer somebody, please just resend the question. Thank you for going to www.shorashimshop.com. Those of you that can or are willing, you can support what we're trying to do by purchasing something that speaks to you. We're not looking for people to donate to what we're doing. Hopefully we've created an array of gifts and items and books that will speak to you. And that's another way of us reaching out to you, but it's also your way of reacting or relating back to us and helping us out. Thank you very much. Until the next time, probably again this week, because this week will be filled with activity. Leitrot. Bye-bye from Jerusalem.